Hi everyone, welcome to our On Demand. It is titled A Brief History of Jazz. Our introduction question would normally be for you to Google the definition of jazz. And if you were to do that, hopefully you would find something like this. Jazz is a type of music of Black American origin characterized by improvisation, syncopation, and usually a regular or forceful rhythm emerging at the beginning of the 20th century. Brass and woodwind instruments and piano are particularly associated with jazz, although guitar and occasionally violin are also used. Styles include Dixieland, swing, bebop, and free jazz. There's also two terms on this page that you might not be aware of. Improvisation, which means to make it up as you go along. Improvisation is used a lot in jazz music. A lot of jazz musicians make it up as they go along and they improvise. Syncopation is music that occurs on the offbeat. Ba, 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 ba. Kind of surprises you. Our objectives: the learner will be able to define jazz, learn about the origins of jazz, hear ragtime music, and understand how it grew into jazz, and become familiar with famous jazz musicians such as Miles Davis and Duke Ellington. The origins of jazz in America. African slaves in the American South began using European musical instruments in the early 19th century. They incorporated their tribal musical traditions with European minstrel performances. Ragtime and Dixie music. Scott Joplin and others popularized ragtime music in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Along with ragtime, Southern Dixie music was created many of the foundations for what would later be called jazz. I'm going to play for you a little bit of Scott Joplin's ragtime music. This is called The Entertainer. So that was also one of our objectives, for you to be able to actually hear some ragtime music. A lot of this music is overlooked when you study about jazz, but ragtime, Dixie music really helped create the foundations for what later would be called jazz. Swing and the big bands. Jazz music became more popular in the 1920s and 1930s with the rise of swing music and the big band orchestras. Many of the jazz's pioneers, like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, were making influential music at this time. Then we have bebop popping in. It breaks the mold. Jazz's popularity continued to grow in the 1940s, but a counter-jazz movement called bebop influenced what was to come later in jazz music. Musicians like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie led the bebop movement. Miles Davis and cool jazz. Miles Davis broke from his early bebop days and started a new jazz movement called cool jazz in the 1950s and 60s. This period had the peak and the start of the decline of jazz's popularity because rock and roll was rising at this time. Jazz moves to the fringe. From the 1970s to today, jazz music has lost a lot of its popularity. Experimental artists like Ornette Coleman and the free jazz movement were not popular with mainstream listeners. Ken Burns' documentary on jazz brought back some of the interest in this genre. Our exit ticket? True or false, jazz music became more popular in the 1920s. I'll give you a second to think about that. And ta-da! There's the answer. Jazz music became more popular in the 1920s and 1930s with the rise of swing music and the big band orchestras. Your independent practice, so actually your exit ticket was true. Jazz music became more popular in the 1920s. Your independent practice, watch the movie titled The History of Jazz. Take the History of Jazz quiz. That's due April 28th. You still have to take the quiz even if you cannot watch the movie. If that is the case, you will need to call tech. It is an MP4 file. Thank you all, and we'll see you next week. Have a musical week.